Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. Listeners, we've got two guests for the price of one, two people I've interviewed before that I'm excited to catch up with, and we will bring them in momentarily. First, wanted to give thanks to our sponsor, Chessable.com. We will be discussing one Chessable course, which is more beginner-oriented, but if you're more intermediate to advanced, of course, they have lots of choices for you. Jovanka Hauska has a new course called Starting Out in the Caro Kann. Caro's solid opening choice, and I really am enjoying this starting out series. Even as like an advanced player, it's nice to get a solid foundation, and you can sort of review the basic concepts and maybe feel like you can trot it out in blitz and proceed from there. Speaking of advanced, Grandmaster Surya Ganguly, of course, who has worked on Viswanathan Anand's World Championship prep team, among many other distinctions. I think as you guys listen to this, actually, he'll probably be in Toronto because he's been working with Vidit Gujrati for the candidates. So anyway, he's got a new Lifetime Repertoires course out on flank openings, and they have tons of other stuff. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, use the link in the description to help support this feeble podcast. Now, as for our guests, so we've got two return guests, two people I am friendly with and excited to welcome back. First up, Laura Smith, who is a national master, former youth champion, who has twice competed in the U.S. Women's Championship. She's now a New York City-based teacher and chess instructor. And together with our other guest, who I'll introduce in a second, they have released a Chessable course, Laura's second, called Can I Take It? A Beginner's Guide to Capturing Pieces. Welcome back, Laura.
Great to be here, Ben, with Dan.
Yeah, it's exciting. And the aforementioned Dan is, of course, the legendary author and teacher, national master as well, former engineer, and now author of 10 books. He's got a great YouTube channel, and I always find him particularly insightful on the topic of adult chess learning. He's a bit of a role model for me in that regard. I've interviewed him once before, which honestly is not enough, but that was episode 138 in 2019. And I forgot to mention about Laura. You can also hear my interview with her, How to Chess Season 3. But Dan, it's good to catch up. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm glad to be back with you.
Yeah, it's exciting to chat with you both. And so the new course, we should say right off the bat for listeners, is primarily beginner-oriented, but I think that there's some concepts that even as you progress up the chess ladder are underemphasized, as we'll be discussing. But before we get to that, I wanted to hear about the genesis of this collaboration. So, Laura, I believe this was your handiwork. So let's hear the story.
Yes. Well, before this course, I was really excited to kind of meet you, Dan, through emails from some other adult learners, a lot of the chess punks on Twitter. And I was like, yay, I was a little starstruck because I love your books. And when I became a Chess in the Schools instructor, my husband who works there, he was like, oh, Laura, check out Dan Heisman's books. They're so great for beginners, because a lot of the material I was watching my students, not about talent, just they weren't ready for those complicated skewers, discover attacks. Like they needed board vision. They needed all the basics. And I always talk about his Back to Basics Tactics book is like my Bible for chess instruction. And, once we started collaborating, I was also, not to get off tangent here, but just the way we started collaborating, I got really back into chess during the pandemic, like a bunch of other people I've heard about. And I did do some streaming, and I was so happy Dan could come on the channel. So we were really interested in helping beginners, and then I was just like, how would you be interested after I did my first Chessable course and learned all the growing pains of like, how do you do that? I felt confident enough to be like, hey, Dan, do you want to co-author a course on all these amazing topics that I've learned from you? And he said, yay. So from there, I was happy to, he sent, I guess we'll talk about this more in the interview, but that was kind of the start of it. And because I already knew the Chessable software, or just how to kind of input things, he was helping me give all the positions, and I was able to put them in a place. So it was a really nice collaboration.
Yeah. Glad to hear it. And Laura, as someone working on a Chessable course, I could use some help with the back end stuff. So I can certainly understand
No, I'm not. I have a lot to learn too.
Yeah, I can certainly understand both perspectives. And so the course is called How to Capture. Again, so it starts right at the beginning with basically taking free pieces, which obviously is very important, especially like below, say, the 1100 level or so. But it progresses from there to what you call counting, Dan. Could you explain, and because I think this is relevant for a large majority of our audience, could you explain for listeners who aren't familiar what you mean by counting, Dan?
All right. I mean by counting that when you have captures possible on a board, you have to figure out, what would happen if those captures happen. Now, when it happens on one square, it's very, very easy. I take, you take, I take, you take, and everybody can do that. And that's really the most basic form of counting. But in a lot of positions, you could make a capture on one square and then somebody else could capture something else on another square, and you end up with things like desperado pieces, and it can get extremely complicated. I remember I was talking with Danny Benjamin once at the U.S. Amateur Team East, National Master Dan Benjamin, and we were looking at a move D5, and Dan said, "Can you get away with that? Is that safe?" And I said, "I think we need a computer to figure this out." And that's a good example of really advanced counting. So when counting doesn't win material, it's not a tactic. Just like when you have a pin and it doesn't win material, it's not a tactic, it's just a pin. When counting doesn't win material, it's not a tactic. But if you say, I could take on H7 and then he takes on A2 and then I take on D5, and when the smoke clears, I'm up a pawn or a knight or the exchange or whatever, that's a tactic, and I call that a counting tactic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of adults in particular struggle with those, like when the smoke clears positions, like, I mean, even up to my level, I feel that these complex variations where, especially, and you guys have some of these as you progress in the course to the more advanced material, where you've got to check and double check, because if it's like two rooks for a bishop for a queen and there's some pawns involved, you're like, all right, am I sure that I'm coming out ahead here? And then there's the question of evaluation when you get to that, which is its own separate thing that we'll get into. But Dan, before we were recording, you also told me the story of sort of the origins of this counting term. Could you delve into that?
Right. Well, I was seeing in different tactics books that there were problems like this, and I use as an example John Nunn's book, Learn Chess Tactics, which is a really good book. It explains a lot about tactics. And he has a chapter called Miscellaneous, because there's certain tactics that didn't fall into a category of a certain motif, like pins or removal of the guard or double attacks. And he put it under miscellaneous. And I was writing an article for Chess Cafe about this, eventually became the first chapter in my book, Back to Basics Tactics. And I wanted to give it a name. I said, this is such a common idea, we need a name. So I contacted Grandmaster Dr. Nunn, John Nunn, on the internet. And he was nice enough to come back to me, and I said, I'd like to give this a name. What about the name counting? And he said, that's as good a name as any. And I figured, well, if Dr. Nunn approves, then I can use it. So I've been trying to use this name for that kind of issue on the board as much as I can to try to popularize it.
And what did you guys do to come up with examples? I mean, I know you've written about and done YouTube videos, Dan, about this in the past, but Laura, how did you guys find the material for these counting examples? Because it is an important, but it's harder to run like a tactics query, as to Dan's point, than it would be for like a pin or a fork or something.
All right, no poker face today. Dan was the mastermind behind that. Let's be real. So I know, Dan, you collect a lot of the positions, I guess. You're very organized, and that's my goal as like a chess coach, to just, have all the materials for different levels, right? And so I'm just thinking of that example when it's like, should the bishop capture the rook on F8, or we're not, because we've been collaborating, and we can maybe put a link in the podcast to the position I'm talking about, because I know we can't really share a screen right now. But basically, I know, Dan, you mentioned you use this position just as a nice quick assessment with a lot of your students. So I know a lot of levels too, but Dan also has like compartmentalize, like, okay, every student who hasn't reached, I don't know, 1100, this problem will be nice to see. What do they say? If they're telling you to win a rook and they don't see that the king's going to win the bishop back, right? That's an evaluation right there. Like, they are not ready to move on until they understand, the Reinfeld values and counting. That's just something that came to mind.
Yeah, and that was something I noted, Dan. I'd seen it before in your writing, this idea of the Reinfeld values. It's another sort of, what's the word, where you're like, cause celebre of yours, to not just refer to peace values as peace values, but Reinfeld values. How did that come about, Dan?
Okay, well, obviously there's different value systems, and my acquaintance, I can't call him my friend because I don't hang out with him, but Larry Kaufman and I have been talking about this for years. And of course, Larry's probably the world's leading expert on peace value. He did that original study, that 1999 article in Chess Life called The Evaluation of Material Imbalances, which I think I have on my website on his permission, but I think it's now been republished on chess.com also, where he did a study of hundreds of millions of positions and determined the average value of the pieces. And Grandmaster Andy Soltis wrote a book called Rethinking the Chess Pieces, where he talks about all the different value systems. But the most common one is the one that they teach beginners, which is all integers, which is the 1, 3, 3, 5, 9 guys. And of course, it didn't have a name. Well, when I was growing up, back in the early days before you guys were born, if you went to a if you went to a bookstore in the United States, a lot of times every single chess book in the bookstore was written by Fred Reinfeld, who was actually a fairly strong master back in the mid 20th century. And he wrote a lot of beginner books, and they mixed and matched his books all over the place. I still have a bunch of them. And these are the kind of things that were in his book. So when I refer to these things over and over again, whenever I have to refer to something a lot, whether it's counting or the value system, I like to give it a name. Like, for instance, Charles Hertan called the idea that a pin piece is not really guarding something a sneaky pin. And I said, why didn't I think of that? Sneaky pin. What a great name.
You're good with the names, though, Dan. Don't sell yourself short.
I like that. I'm going to take
Charles
a note
Hertan
right now.
in Power Chess for Kids came up with that name. Well, I like to do that, too, because it's helpful when you're teaching people to have names. So for these numbers, I said, if you're going to use the basic integer numbers for beginners, why don't we give it a name? And in honor of Fred Reinfeld, I call them the Reinfeld numbers.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm willing to roll with that one too. And hearing you discuss sort of the historic evolution of these chess concepts, Dan, makes me think about the topic, as I mentioned, of adult learning, where I consider you something of a pioneer. So when you started, Dan, I think in our previous interview, you said you've primarily, obviously you coached youth champions like the aforementioned Dan Benjamin and some others that I used to tangle with way back in the day, and people, past my generation. But at what point did it dawn on you that there's a difference between how adults learn and kids learn, if I'm not leading the witness too much here?
Yeah, I won't say there's a difference. It's not on difference necessarily how they learn. It's more how they pick things up and run with them, so to speak, is more like the way I would put it. For instance, if you're teaching someone who's like, I started teaching Dan Benjamin when he was 11, and he was an unrated player. And at the time, Josh Waitzkin was also 11, and Josh was already, renowned in the top number 11-year-old in the country. And by the time they were 13, Dan had caught up with Josh in rating. They were both like 2,300 at that point. And, but those guys are going through puberty, and their brain is starting to develop the deductive logic capabilities and stuff that really tremendously help certain types of chess logic and so on. And of course, adults already have that, but adults have a lot of other things on their mind. They have to pay taxes, they have families, they have lots of things they have to do.
Yeah.
Their brain is slowing down. I think there's a website where it gives you the equation on how much your brain slows down per unit time. It's something over something squared, or square root of your age or something. But your brain slows down, and your brain is a little less plastic and so on. So it's not that they're really learning differently. It's that they have these things to overcome. But I heard,
They're learning
but I heard
slower.
about a 90-year-old who took up chess and he was rated like 8 or 900, and by the time he was 93, he was up to like 12 or 1300. So
That's great.
Yeah, I've heard those kind of stories too more
yeah,
recently.
and it's
And Laura,
because as long as you have a lot to learn, you can get better. Sure, if you're one of the top grandmasters in the world, if you're Magnus Carlsen, you're probably not as good at 38 as you were at 28. But if you were a beginner at 38, you can be way better at 48 than you were at 38.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And Laura, I know you you've worked in some school programs, done some lessons, some private lessons with kids. Have you worked with many adults?
I've done more online, to be honest, but now I have a couple of adult learners that I'm just enjoying teaching, but not to the scale of like Dan or some other coaches with adult learners, but I love teaching adults.
And have you noticed any, I mean, obviously there's some benefits too. You can talk to them like adults, for example.
Yes. It's just so nice.
Yeah.
And like, not to get off track, but like, I think I mentioned in our last, maybe not, I do a chess and sip just for fun. Every Wednesday in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And a lot of like, it's really cool. Like, oh, buy me a glass of wine. Oh yeah, I'll teach you some chess.
Right.
Like we're not exchanging, like, you understand? It's like more banter, more fun. And yeah, I guess, sorry to go off track there, but in terms of, you know, what's different, I feel like they maybe, and this could be very like, I don't know, maybe it's too simplified, but I feel like they really listen to my feedback like quickly. Like I can just say something and then even in that little interaction, they're like using what I said. I'm like, thank you. And then other times though, their calculation is not going to be as speedy as a younger student, right? So it's just different. Yeah. I'm like, oh, you did listen to how I said to try to castle early. And they're doing it. Like, unlike a younger, like a 5 or 6 year old, I might say it many times and they don't believe me. But that's also exciting because we want kids to be thinking and like seeing, oh, you got checkmated 7 or 8 times against your buddies. If you castle your king, you won't get checkmated that early. Then they'll do it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works the other way around. Sometimes the adults are more stubborn. You tell the kids something and they go, yes, sir, you're the teacher. And you tell the adult and they go, well, I'm an adult. I don't have to follow that if I don't want to. And then they keep doing it wrong over and over again. And the kid is like, no, I'm afraid to do it wrong. I want to. Right. So you get it both ways.
It cuts both ways for sure. Because where I was going to go based on what Laura said, Dan, is I found that adults can sometimes interpret things too rigidly. And I was reviewing everyone's second chess book. Forgive me if that's not exactly the title, but I was reviewing your book, Dan, and I came across the part where you're talking about where you call it the I don't want to capture this queen because it doubles my pawns problem. And
yes, oh, true. Yeah, there is that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Which is not for anyone listening who's newer to chess. That's not, we're not making fun of you. I think that the fact that resonated with both Laura and me shows that, and the fact that your books were written, in some cases more than a decade ago, and you still see these human tendencies. To me, it shows that there's something very basic and evolutionary where, like, when an adult is presented with a set of rules, they want to sort of apply them more broadly than chess permits you to. For better or for worse. So Dan, as we alluded to earlier, I've got a Patreon mailbag question related to evaluation. So this is from Tyron Ross Price, who is a fan of your work. So Tyron, following up on the general theme of this course, writes, he says, calculation and evaluation go hand in hand, but if you can see a position in your mind, but you do not evaluate it well, then that calculation is useless. Does Dan have any tips on how to evaluate positions more accurately during calculation? Also, any tips on how to conceptualize the board better, how to improve board vision after looking several ply? And I know you've written about this at length. So.
Yeah, I would say those 3 questions, you could probably write, half a book just answering those questions. And I don't want to bore everybody for half an hour here. So
you're never boring. You have all the answers.
Well, visualization, I call that a root skill for analysis. My bottom line is a little ditty I came up with, which is you can't play what you don't see. And that involves not seeing candidate moves, but it also means if you can't visualize the position, you can't figure out what's going on. So if your visualization is bad, it's really hard to evaluate, because if you look even 2 moves ahead and you can't see the position very clearly, it's hard to evaluate. Now, what's also interesting is I've written 2 different types of things on evaluation. There's the recent book by Perelshteyn and I forget the other author, Solon, which is Evaluate Like a Grandmaster, is all about evaluating entire positions. And in that book, they agree with me that the 4 major parts of evaluating positions are material, king safety, the activity of the pieces, and the pawn structure. Everything else, like space and stuff, can be folded into those things. But when I wrote my first book, I hate to say it, but I wrote it almost exactly 50 years ago. On a typewriter, it was Elements of Positional Evaluation. But when I said positional evaluation, I didn't mean the evaluation of positions, where that was misunderstood. It's anything positional, which really had to do with the pieces themselves. Like, why is a bishop and a knight completely different, but they're worth almost the same? And why is the rook the only piece on the board that if the board's empty, it can move to the same 13 squares on every single board position, but every other piece has more mobility when it's in the middle of the board and less mobility on the edge of the board, stuff like that. So there's different aspects to the evaluation that we're talking about. But basically, if you don't see the position, you can't evaluate it. But when you are evaluating the position, I think if you look at those 4 things, king safety, material, pawn structure, the piece activity, those would be the starting points. And when they asked Kasparov how important is piece activity in chess, his answer was, it's everything.
Mm-hmm. Easy for him to say, though, because he's, he doesn't have to worry about blundering and, all these other more human mistakes. And Dan, what about Tyron's question about the sort of visualization improvement?
Okay, there's like a million websites that help you improve your chess visualization, and they use all kinds of different techniques. Some of the websites are paid, some of them are free. Some of them use color the squares. They say if you can figure out that H1 is white and that G6 is dark, that helps you visualize. It never helped me, but a lot of people think that helps them, and I tell people, if it helps you, great, do it. I also tell people when you're doing these visualization exercises, and there's so many different ones of them. Andy Soltis has one in his book, Studying Chess Made Easy. When you're doing these visualization exercises, if it's fun, it'll probably help you. If it's not fun, even if you think it'll help you, it probably won't help you that much. That's generally true with anything in a hobby, unless you're a professional chess player. If the work is fun, it'll probably help you. If the work's not fun, it won't. So some of these visualization exercises, like pass it forward and so on, are probably a lot of fun for some people, and for other people, it's probably kind of painful.
What is, do you mind if what is pass it forward?
Let's say you have a tactical problem, white to play and win a knight. But instead of winning the knight on move 27, you show them the position on move 25. You give them moves 25 and 26 for white and black. And then you say white to play and win a knight. But you're showing them the position on move 25. And the problem is you have to win the piece on move 27. And they're not going to show you position 27.
Yeah, like the visualized courses for Chessable,
exactly.
which I'm a big fan of. Laura, do you agree with what Dan said? I have my own opinion that I'll interject in a second, but do you agree with what Dan said about if it's fun?
Well, in my experience, again, just to be very transparent, I played competitively till about 18, 19, 20, then took a long break, college, grad school, blah, 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 right? And then, so I'm super rusty, but I do remember when I was at my into chess mode, right? And I'll just be, again, end games have always been, but I wasn't good at it. But I know that's a whole topic, right? Did I put the work in? No, because I avoided it because I didn't like it, because I thought I wasn't good at it, right? Maybe if I was 20 again and I could again, maybe, and no, you could do it at any age. I just don't prioritize my chess study at this point in life. If I was to find if you can find me one, I'll bet you I'll do it. A fun endgame course for an expert and above. Or I know the square of the pawn. Great.
Right. Yeah.
But endgame was always such a a hard, so if it's not fun, don't study it. But it would help me because many times I'm just like, I don't know if I want to go into that end game because I don't feel confident.
Yeah. See, I'm with you, Laura. See, for me, I think if it's fun, you're more likely to stick with it, which will have a great long range benefit. But there is not, like, I don't find calculation work to be tremendously fun. I do find it fun to get better at chess, and I would be more likely to get better at chess if I did more calculation work. But for me, I'm not sure if I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, I'm just saying you get more out of it if it's fun.
You do get more. You get more out of it, and again, you're more likely to come back.
Right. I mean, sometimes people work on something that's not fun for a month, and it helps them a little bit, but eventually they get diminishing returns on their time.
Yeah, and it might not be sustainable. And Laura, so I know you're mostly retired, and we should say, so Laura's teaching full time. You've got what, 3 kids? Three kids and doing chess stuff. Yep. So not keeping up with your OTP game is totally understandable. But you did play in the famed U.S. Amateur East with a friend of the pod, Alyssa Melakina, among others. So Laura, what was it like to dust off the chess pieces and actually compete recently?
So fun. Very, very fun. Alyssa sent me a text. Hey, any chance you want to play in the Amateur East? And I just, like always, whenever there's a fun opportunity, texted family and saw if anyone could watch the kids. They said sure. And then, we were there. It was so fun. With Raja, Grandmaster elect, her boyfriend on board 1, her on board 2, me on board 3, and her dad on board 4. We had such a blast. It was just so fun. And like in between rounds, I was really lucky. We would like escape to get a nice meal, which is fun as a mom who never gets to eat alone. And then we got free analysis. Raja was like, let's get the board out. Nice. I'm like, you sure? Your time. This is your time. And he would go over all our games, and I learned a lot. And I got more. I mean, again, have I been studying this last month? No, but I feel like now for next February, watch out, because now I know how you got to do it to understand it. You got to compete in order to know what's wrong with your game. So I've been toying with some amazing Chessable courses, like the Black Lion by Grandmaster
Ginger GM,
yeah. And I love like looking at courses, but there's nothing like sitting across someone with a slow game ahead, and like you better be like planning what's gonna happen, and even at the amateur level. So I really, just thinking about it, you could see how I'm excited about it because it was fun. My results were not the best, but each game felt interesting. There was only a couple. I'm like, oh gosh, the last game I got tired. No excuses.
Yeah, no,
right?
But that's an exhausting tournament.
Tired, and I'm like, oh gosh, the coffee's not hitting, and I just played. I made a mistake.
Dan, any chance of an OTP comeback from you?
No, in fact, I was trying to think. Did I play you in my last tournament, the Liberty Bell in 1991?
You had to remind me about that game, but I think so.
Yeah, I think I was probably younger then than you are now.
Wow. Yeah. Time flies. Do you have that game, by the way?
Oh, yeah.
Dan? Okay. You'll have to send it to me, and then I'll review it. And if it's publishable, then maybe someone can see it. But I'll have to evaluate that.
What was the result?
Yeah, what was the result, Dan?
I think you had a slight advantage, and then you made a mistake, and I was able to win. If that sounds reasonable.
That sounds very plausible. And Dan, let's talk about chess books a bit. So I have in my book and on my webpage, I have recommended chess books, but I also always recommend your recommendations. Dan, what would you say is your number one most recommended chess book when people ask you? Oh my goodness.
Well, it depends on the subject. It's like saying, what's your favorite book to recommend? It's like, well, are we talking math? Or are we talking history here?
Right. Let's say intermediate level.
Well, for intermediate puzzles, it's Coakley's book, Winning Chess Exercises for Kids, which is definitely not just for kids. If you compare it to Reinfeld's 1001 Combination and Sacrifices, it beats it in every sense. It's got better problems. It's got better answers. It's just a much better book. So
that's the blue one, right?
That's the blue one, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just to say a little bit more about that book, what I like about it is the problems are somewhat mixed, and they're very well curated. So yeah, I would say 1400 to 1600 level
Maybe
or
even
something.
above that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. So Laura, aside from Dan's books, do you have any favorite chess books?
I mean, yes, I love the step method. I've talked about it on your last class. Our last interview, sorry. Yeah, I just love that it for both kids and adults, it feels like it doesn't leave any stone unturned. I love that it really does begin with this is a rook and the rook moves side to side and up and down. Find the way for the rook to get to this square the quickest way. And then it goes up until the sixth level, which I can look at problems that are realistic in there and also be challenged. So I really love that you can, and I've heard so much about like how in other countries where chess is more like even more maybe integrated into the curriculum, a lot of kids do that and then they can play chess quite well.
Yeah, for sure. I
From that.
mean, Jordan von Forest, when I interviewed him, he grew up on the steps method. I mean, there's tons of grandmasters, especially in the Netherlands. It's a great resource. Dan, have you checked out the steps method?
I asked them for some study material, but they only sent me the first book, which was kind of introduction to introduction. So I don't really have a good feel for it. No.
Yeah, you should check it out. It's worth. I'd love to hear your opinion when you get a chance to dig into the more advanced material. I've said this before, but to me, it's the puzzle curation that really stands out from that series. And yeah, listeners, among other things, check out my How to Chess interview with Laura if you want to hear more about it, or my interview with Jaap de Lamar, who's a certified steps trainer, or with Han Schutt, who also has a helpful YouTube video. So tons of stuff that you guys can check out from there. And I understand, Dan, that you also have a chess book on the way.
Yes, I have a book. I do ever since 2009. I've been doing the chess tip of the day on Twitter at Dan Heisman. Excuse me. And so I give a tip every day, and I wanted to expand it into a book. So every man is publishing a book of 164 tips where I've expanded the tips from not just a paragraph, but 2 to 4 pages where I have diagrams and everything like that. And hopefully the book will come out this year. I submitted it last year and they said it was fine, but it hasn't been published yet. But that'll be my 13th chess book.
Yeah, and there's lots of good material there. I mean, for people listening, you can just, as I always say, for people who are not on Twitter, like you can still just Google Dan's account and just scroll through the history, and there's a lot of helpful advice there. And as it happens, Laura, we're catching you guys all at a busy time. So your first Chessable course is also possibly coming to book, right?
Yeah, I'm really excited. It's so cool with the collaboration with New in Chess and Chessable. So I felt like it really does feel like a chess family because I don't have to they're all in one. So it's like when I was contacted, I didn't have to be like, wait 1 second, let me ask Chessable. No, they're saying, yep, all good, which is nice in life because sometimes it feels like you have so many hurdles to go through just to get to another step. But so it's looking really great. And I'm just going to be working on breaking the diagrams like more so that when it's readable, because it's a beginner book, I want to make sure it's a nice, easy read. Not have, because I know my adult learners have said when they have a book, it can be hard to calculate from just like one diagram for a position. So this will be new for me. I'll definitely be reaching out maybe to Dan, sorry in advance, and any other amazing chess authors to find how to do that best.
Okay.
Because this will be my first.
By the way, we should say that for our Chessable course, Laura did all the Chessable work. I have to give her so much credit. I was the one who sort of figured out what diagrams we might want to use. But, if you watch the course, it's 97% her. And I come on at the start and say, hi, I helped, But she gets all the credit for doing all the Chessable work there.
Video, all the diagrams from you. So thank you for that. But couldn't have done. I feel like it was great because we both had I had the ability to do the what's it called, the crunch work, right?
Formatting,
and just every time I got an email with all the diagrams, what to say, yay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and
that's hard to do. That's the hard part.
And Dan, that feeds into another question from Tyron Ross Price, which is, are you planning any Chessable courses that will be geared more towards intermediate to advanced players?
Well, my problem is not so much the course, it's I depend on Laura to do the Chessable stuff because it's
so maybe I should ask Laura.
It's so hard. Yeah, that's true. The answer is we don't currently have anything in mind. We could certainly do a follow-up to this course with intermediate counting, because we left off where it was just starting to get tricky for people, 12, 1300. But we really didn't get into the things that would be challenging even for, more intermediate players.
Yeah. There's definitely plenty of runway to create more. So hopefully if this finds an audience, because the people who read this will need more advanced material. So it is worth checking out. And Dan, so I know you're always busy with private students. Like, how many hours are you teaching a week these days, if you don't mind my asking?
Less than I used to. I'm down to about maybe a dozen hours a week now.
Okay. Yeah, that's still a good amount, probably more than Laura can manage given her other responsibilities.
Oh, yeah.
And Dan, so let me ask, I mean, obviously it's a common topic here on the pod, how the chess culture has changed and chess learning has accelerated. Is that something that you see in just working with your adult students online?
Not as much, because I think the people who really hit that hard are the younger kids who, are more computer savvy and kind of use the engines and stuff to teach themselves as much. The older students, and, I still have younger students too, but the older students, I still have to kind of push. Like, I have some students who only play what used to be called correspondence chess, which is now daily chess. And they're allowed to use databases. Mm-hmm. They're allowed to use books. They're allowed to move the pieces around. And a lot of them, when they first come to me, and they say, I play daily chess, and I say, do you use the databases? Do you move the pieces around? They say no. They don't do that. So they're not as savvy that way. And I sort of say, well, if the rules allow you to use a database, you should definitely use a database. And I say you can learn the opening really well by challenging the database every time you have a move to figure out what move you want to play, and perusing the database is really a good learning experience. So I have to kind of teach them how to do that. And in fact, on my YouTube channel, I have a 4-part series on how to pick out tabias, how to pick out a repertoire, how to use a database, and so on how to learn openings.
Okay. And are you using, so obviously you're from the chess-based generation, Dan, do you use Lichess Studies at all these days?
Now, for about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I switched to Lichess, so that now when I teach someone over the internet, they just follow me, and I click on Zoom or on YouTube, on Lichess. I click on follow me, and I just bring up a Lichess board, and I create a separate study for each of my students so that we can just go through the study and show them things.
Nice. And Laura, do you ever, I mean, I know you had at least one student recently, shout out to Donnie Ariel and his daughter, but do you have room for any students these days with your super busy schedule?
Absolutely, yeah. And I always see, like, there's certain days when my kids, I have like babysitters or like family helping me, like Sunday mornings and Fridays. Okay, yeah. It's like, but then in summer it gets a little open, much more open.
That makes sense.
Because then my day job is done,
right.
And then I can do my passion, like my other.
Nice. And Dan, when I interviewed you in 2019, and I asked you if you were taking students, you had some clever way of saying, I'm always willing to take students. It's just a matter.
I love it. Let's hear it so I can write.
Yeah, just a matter of scheduling. Do you stand by that statement here in 2024?
I'm less busy than I was. So because of supply and demand, I raised my rates, which of course, if you look at the price of food, my rates are probably in line with the price of food rise. But, I try to charge enough that, one person once came up to me and said, if you charge $25 an hour, I'd take lessons from you. And I said, no, you wouldn't. If I charge $25 an hour, I'd be turning everybody away. So,
right.
So yes, I can still make room for pretty much anyone because of that reason.
Okay, glad to hear it. And I'll link to both Laura and Dan's info. Dan, any other topics to bring up? So we've got the Reinfeld values. Oh, I've got actually a term I wanted to ask you about from reviewing your books. This one. So Dan, for context, as I mentioned, I'm working on a Chessable course called Critical Moments. Basically, it's for intermediate level, primarily 1,000 to 1,500. And I'm also trying to identify some situations are well known and tactics are already named, but I've also got a couple that I've noticed on my own and I'm trying to name on my own. But in reviewing your book, I see that some of the stuff I could build upon. Some of it you got there first, of course, as is always the case. But one term I saw, putting you on the spot here, is floobly.
Floobly.
Floobly. What's a floobly?
Okay, so suppose you're in a basketball game and there's 10 seconds left on the clock and your team's leading 100-12. Well, the only way you're going to lose is if you start a fight and the referee forfeits your team, but you could lie down on the court and you can't possibly not win. But in chess, that's never true. Even if you have a king and two queens against the king, you could stalemate the king and you could not win. So chess is a lot different than basketball or football, even though they both have clocks. You can always not win from an easily winning position. So I use the name floobly for when you're completely ridiculously winning and your opponent decides not to resign, and there's still some way that you could not win. And if you allow that to happen, that's a floobly. So for instance, if you have a king and two queens against the king and you stalemate him, that's a floobly. If you're up two queens and you let him back rank mate you, that's a floobly. Well, so I tell people, when you're killing people, it doesn't matter how you win. If you have a million ways to win and 2 ways to lose, make sure that you stop the 2 ways you could not win or draw or lose. I said, don't allow the floobly. So I needed a name for that crazy situation where you throw away your win or your draw by allowing your opponent something that you could easily have stopped. That the reason he's not resigning is because he sees you could back rank mate you or whatever it is. And I call that the floobly. So I had a novice nook called Don't Allow the Floobly, which is all about your mindset of what you want to do when you're way, way ahead in a game.
Yeah, it's a really important concept. And yeah, I had a chapter about it that's probably not going to make it in the book. And I hadn't seen, in the course, and I hadn't seen your floobly discussion. I had seen it, but I'd forgotten about it until I was getting ready for this interview. But where did you get the actual term?
Oh,
you just made it up?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's probably lost in antiquity at my age. But I like to make up names for things, whether it's in chess or not, somehow you'll call your wife a nickname. My first wife, Holly, who unfortunately passed away from breast cancer, I used to call her Noobs, and explaining how that came about would take 5 minutes, which is not worth it. But floobly is sort of in the Noobs category.
Yeah. And do you have something to add, Laura? Sorry.
No, it's so fun to come up with fun names. Again, that maybe ties into what we were saying. We do want to make learning fun, and beginners, if it's maybe that's kind of the investment in learning. If it's fun, funny, jargon, it's more easy to get into it.
Yeah, and more easy to stick with it.
And I wanted a word like floobly, which didn't have any real meaning. Because it was such a ridiculous situation, I wanted to give it for emphasis that it has a crazy name.
I like it. So Dan, out of all the terms you've coined, we've discussed calling piece values, Reinfeld values, and counting, of course, the theme of your Chessable course. Is there one term that you feel most proud of, or that you feel has penetrated the lexicon the most?
Well, we know Hope Chess has penetrated the lexicon the most.
Oh, for sure,
and
yeah.
It's funny, somebody took me to task, and they did a search, and they found somebody used Hope Chess in a different way than I did in 1981 in Chess Life. And they said, we found this article in Chess Life where he called it Hope Chess, and he's not using it the way you use it, so you can't claim that you created it. And I said, okay, if it's in 1981 Chess Life, I can't argue. But my definition of Hope Chess was not everything you could hope for in chess, like, I just made a blunder, I hope he doesn't see it, or I'll make a stupid threat that he could easily stop, and I hope he doesn't stop it so I can win the game. That's not what I meant. For Hope Chess, I simply meant you don't check to see if your move is safe. You make a move and don't look to see if your opponent has a check, capture, or threat that you can't make on the next move. And all of a sudden he makes a threat and you go, oh my goodness, I didn't see that. I hope I can meet it. And of course, if you can't, the game's over. And I said, if you're not checking to see if your move is safe consistently on every move, that's hope chess. And that was my definition. But people took it and run with it, and they took it to mean everything you could hope for in a game of chess. And they said, Dan Heisman made up this word hope chess. So now I make bad moves, and I hope they don't see why they're bad, or I make threats, and I hope they don't make them. And that's Dan Heisman's hope chess. And now I just put up my hands and I go, okay, well, I'll take credit for it, even though that's not what I meant.
Well, I often credit you and quote you for hand waving, Dan, as well.
Hand waving is when you're making a move on general principles, and hand waving is okay. Let's say your opponent plays A3 on the first move and you don't have a book move. You can hand wave your reply to A3 with black. But if you get into an analytical position where you have to figure out what you need to do, and instead of figuring it out whether its move is safe and what's going to happen, you just say, I think I'll just take the piece that's worth the most or some principle.
Centralize my rook.
That's hand waving. And that's a big mistake that a lot of adults make, because a lot of adults don't know how to analyze positions. They can't visualize well enough. They just don't even know what analyzing a position really means. And to them, analyzing a position is just hand waving. So I came up with that term to describe what happens when people do that, when they use general principles to make analytical moves.
Yeah. And getting back to what I said earlier, it does illustrate this sort of timeless quality of the sort of thought processes that people have as they develop in chess, because I think it's a fairly natural thing to do to either you haven't learned how to calculate, or let's face it, it's hard work, so you just want to sort of make a move and fall back on principles and hope for the best. But unfortunately, chess is a brutal game, right, Laura? Unforgiving.
Unforgiving.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. We look forward to the books from both of you. Laura, we look forward to the continued comeback story, even if it unfolds just once a year, maybe until your kids get older. Laura, anything to add as we start to say goodbye?
Oh, it's just been great to be back, Ben. Thanks for having me. And again, Dan, thank you so much for agreeing to this crazy idea I had to make a Chessable course with all these, with all the collaborating and all the emails and me bothering you for diagrams. Thank you.
Okay. And Dan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have to throw it right back. I mean, anybody who watches the course is going to think it's 90% Laura, and it really is. She does all the hard work. I just kind of come up and say, here's a good example we could use.
Okay, great. And as a final thought for listeners rated, say, over 1,200, this probably isn't the course for you, but when your friends get into chess, you know what to recommend them now, because these are two great teachers, and I've checked out the material, and it's definitely very helpful if you're getting your feet wet in chess to learn this concept all at once and for all, rather than just slowly through the school of hard knocks. So great work by both of you, and it was great to catch up.
Thank you very much. Man. Thanks, everybody, for listening in.